Today's video is brought to you by Cars and Bids, my online enthusiast car auction site that recently sold this, and this, and this, and this, and this. Check it out at carsandbids.com. This is a 1995 Oldsmobile Aurora, and it's the future. Or at least it's what General Motors thought the future would look like back in the 1990s when this car came out. Sleek new lines, some technology risks, a totally new engine. It was a big deal back in the day. Of course, it failed miserably, but it's fun to look back and see what happened. And today I'm going to review the Aurora, and we're going to do just that. All right, time for the quirks and features of the original Oldsmobile Aurora. And I'm going to start with a general overview to help explain why I'm excited to film a video with this mid-90s GM sedan. And I am quite excited for this video. So let's talk about it. Oldsmobile hasn't existed for almost 20 years now, but back in the day, it was a General Motors luxury brand, sort of mid-tier luxury. It slotted between Chevrolet, which was the everyman mainstream brand, and then Cadillac, which was the flagship of the lineup. Think of it as sort of like Acura, maybe, compared to Mercedes-Benz, the sort of lower tier luxury brand. Now, you're probably thinking, wait, doesn't Buick occupy that spot in the GM lineup? And the answer is yes, and it didn't make sense to any of us back then either. Nobody really knew what the difference was between those brands. Now, in this era, the 1980s and early 90s, Oldsmobile sales were in rapid decline. In 1985, they sold 1.1 million cars. By 1993, it was down to 400,000. And there were two big reasons for this drop. One was the products were getting old and stodgy and outdated. They needed something fresh. And the other was increased competition from Japanese luxury brands. You know, Lexus and Acura, they're seen as taking on the Germans, Mercedes-Benz, BMW, but they had a big effect on the American brands as well. And their arrival really dropped the sales of the Oldsmobiles and the Buicks, and they had a hard time competing with these new Japanese brands. So Oldsmobile needed to do something radical, something fresh, something totally, completely different in order to win back the customers it was losing and prove to people that they still had it and they could compete in the 1990s, this brave new luxury brand world. And that was the Aurora. This was based on the 1980s Oldsmobile tube car concept, which seemed radical at the time, but the production Aurora stayed surprisingly true to that design, with flowy, curvy lines, a big departure from the boxy 1980s, especially for Oldsmobile. It was a totally radical shift in the way their cars looked, embracing the future of design, or so it seemed at the time. But the Aurora was more radical than just the curvy exterior design. How about the fact there's no Oldsmobile badges anywhere on this car? Oldsmobile was seen as this stodgy, old school brand, so they got rid of it. The wheel center caps don't say Oldsmobile. In fact, they don't say anything. You don't see Oldsmobile appear anywhere on the side of the car. In back, it just said Aurora, not Oldsmobile, nothing else, just Aurora. You had to know, or you had to wonder, which probably was the point. And up front, you had this logo, which was not Oldsmobile's logo. It was totally new, completely created just for this car, sort of a futuristic, more modern take on the regular Oldsmobile logo. It was a brave new world. And speaking of the front, another radical change up here, this car had no grille. Back in the 90s, every car had a grille. In today's world with electric cars, it's not as rare, but ditching the grille entirely was completely radical, something nobody nobody had really tried before this car, losing the grille design in front. It was, again, a totally new, totally fresh take on what the sedan was supposed to look like, especially the Oldsmobile sedan. And another huge risk came under the hood, where the Aurora didn't use any of the typical GM engines that powered all the other cars, the 3800 V6, some variation of the LT V8. Instead, it borrowed a form of the Northstar V8, which was Cadillac's brand new V8 engine that had just come out. Now, this was tremendously controversial at the time because Northstar had been walled off as an entirely Cadillac project, not to be shared with the other General Motors brands. But the thinking was the Aurora was completely new, completely different, and it needed a piece of that powertrain, and so they did it. And it would be over a decade before any non-Cadillac would get another Northstar V8. Now, the engine in the Aurora wasn't just the Cadillac V8 dropped in this car. It had been altered. The Cadillacs had a 4.6-liter V8. This was a 4-liter V8, but it was derived from the Northstar, although General Motors decided it was different enough to call it the Aurora V8, and they printed on the top, made exclusively for Oldsmobile by General Motors, which wasn't really true, but since this version of the engine was only in this car, I guess they could get away with it. Now, in terms of power, the Aurora V8 made 250 horsepower and about 260 pound-feet of torque, which was roughly competitive at the time with other luxury sedans this size. Think Acura Legend, Mercedes-Benz E-Class. That was roughly the size competitors for the Aurora. All of these were front-wheel drive, which was fairly standard for a lot of luxury sedans at the time, and all Aurora models had a 4-speed automatic transmission. Again, fairly standard for the time period and the type of car. But as radical as everything was that I just talked about, the exterior design, the Northstar-derived V8, the no grille, the no badging, nothing was as radical in the Aurora as the interior. The biggest deal in here was it didn't share anything with other General Motors vehicles. I cannot tell you how important this was at the time. General Motors was famous for its cost-cutting and part-sharing. From Chevrolet all the way up to Cadillac, cars had the same switches, buttons, steering wheels, everything was the same. It was kind of a running joke about General Motors. So for this car to be completely, radically different, except for the radio, that display was shared, everything else was changed, it was a huge deal. So let's go through this totally reimagined interior, starting with the obvious, the driver cockpit area. That was a trend of the 90s, to angle controls and switches toward the driver, but the Aurora took it to a crazy degree. The center control stack is angled towards the driver more than basically any other one I've ever seen. In fact, it's so angled towards the driver that it has enough room on its side for a passenger climate vent to just be positioned there. The goal was to really make the driver feel special in this car, that they were sitting in a new futuristic cockpit design, and Oldsmobile could hang with, well, BMW, who was famously doing it too. Now, speaking of the passenger climate vent for a second, one very interesting thing, the other passenger climate vent is on the passenger door panel. As you can see, it's right here, and just below that is the passenger climate control temperature dial. They had it separate from the climate controls in the center because all that was tilted towards the driver, so the passenger got their own climate temp dial mounted on the door panel. Very unusual, but that's the beginning of the weird stuff in this car. The other interesting thing about the climate control adjustment was the general controls were located in the center stack, as you can see, and they were odd. The fan speed dial had a lighting area going around the top that would light up as you twisted the fan speed lower or higher to let you know where you had it. In the center of these controls, you had little quarter circles that corresponded to cold or hot to change the temperature of the climate control air. And if that's not interesting enough, how about this? You also have climate controls on the steering wheel, a switch for fan speed, as you can see, and another switch for temperature right on the wheel. I love this feature, and some American luxury cars had this into the 90s and early 2000s. I wish it had never gone away and we could still get our climate controls on the steering wheel, but alas, it is gone, and yet the Aurora had it. And it gets even crazier in the center control stack above the climate controls. You can see there's a little screen that shows the date. You're thinking, what exactly is that, and what if I want to see something other than the date? Ha! Well, you can. Press this little unlabeled black circle and the lid opens up in this area and shows all of your different options beyond just the date. You can show your fuel economy, your current fuel range, your average speed, obviously the date, like I said, all controlled with buttons that are individually numbered so you can pull up exactly what you want to see. This is a precursor to a modern central infotainment screen, but here, instead of a touchpad and a giant screen you pinch to zoom, it's controlled with individual buttons and one two-color screen above it to show you a few pieces of car information. Yet, this was fairly radical at the time. Now, if you follow the design of the interior above that information lid screen area, you can trace the cockpit feel all the way over to the driver door panel, which also includes the driver climate vent, just like on the passenger side, same deal on the driver side. And the warning lights are included in this cockpit array as well. On this black panel above the gauge cluster, this is where all of your typical dashboard warnings are. Instead of mounted in the gauge cluster itself like you'd usually find them, they're all up here, which again was very different, very futuristic, and very not GM. Now, also in this vicinity on the door panel, you had your seat controls, which was unquestionably taken from Mercedes-Benz, as they have done this for years and years. Basically, nobody else does. Oldsmobile figured they'd get in on it. Seat controls and lumbar controls directly above them, mounted on the door panel. Also interesting around here is the stalks coming off the steering column. In this era, all General Motors cars used the same wiper and turn signal stalks. All of them, Cadillac, Chevy, didn't matter, no exceptions, the same except for the Aurora. The signal stalk also integrated cruise control, and putting both of those things on one stalk was a big deal for General Motors at the time. The wiper stalk was over on the other side, and the operation of the wipers is kind of interesting. When you're not using them, they're sort of in a down position. You turn on the wipers and you can see they pop up first and then they start wiping. And when you turn them off, they stop and then go back down. I guess keeping them in this like lower position helped improve the look of the car. So the wipers weren't just sitting up on the windshield, but it made it look and maybe actually be more aerodynamic, but interesting wiper operation. Now in this vicinity, you also have the Twilight Sentinel, which is what General Motors called the feature where your lights stay on when you park the car at night and you walk into the house, and after a few seconds they turn off. This dial allowed you to adjust how long those lights stayed on. It was the Twilight Sentinel feature. Also interesting in here, I always thought was strange, the gear selector, which you can see here. It's an automatic, like I said, all of these cars were 4-speed autos, but it's this monolith that sticks up from the center console, and it's mounted on this like plastic surface that almost makes it look like the gear lever is floating when you're moving it between the gears. It's certainly odd, very different from what you'd expect in a 90s GM product. I guess that was the idea, and it's kind of strange to see it now. On the side, you can also see there's another button that let you switch between power mode and normal. I guess this was like a transmission sport mode that presumably would tighten up the shifting. Now, as an overall proposition, this interior and its design was actually pretty forward thinking. The materials are not that great in here. A lot of plastic and some cheap stuff, even kind of beyond what other near luxury cars would have had in the day. But the cockpit feel, the screen with different readouts, this was some relatively advanced stuff for any automaker, let alone General Motors. Unfortunately, it didn't work. The Oldsmobile brand was beyond saving. Even with this radically new, totally different, modern, futuristic car, you just couldn't make people buy an Oldsmobile. Sales continued to decline. This car was not really a success, and the entire Oldsmobile brand closed for good in 2004. It all came to an end. But this car, well, they tried. But next we move on to the back seat in the Aurora, where we can pretend like the party is still going, at least for now. You open up the back door and you're greeted by this wood panel which hides an ashtray and a cigarette lighter in each rear door. Clearly, Oldsmobile borrowed a page out of the Germans' books for this one. Dual rear ashtrays and cigarette lighters back here. Other interesting rear quirks, one of them, you got climate vents back here on the back of the front center console, and you also have this bizarrely large dial that lets you adjust the amount of airflow. It's not really positioned next to the vents and it's unlabeled, but that's what the dial does. Kind of strange to see that here. You also have a center armrest, as you can see. Put it down and it gives you cup holders, and then there's a lid and you have a little extra storage back here, which is a nice touch too. The only other interesting thing worth mentioning in the back is rear seat room. I have good knee room and leg room, but headroom was robbed just a little bit by this car's sloping roofline. It's flowy, curvy design. My head is kind of pushing up against the ceiling if I sit up straight. Not ideal, but not really so bad. It's generally pretty nice back here, especially for most non-incredibly tall people. And next we move on to the trunk, the cargo area in the Aurora, which is actually surprisingly large. You wouldn't think that the flowy, curvy design would lend itself to a big trunk, but it has a big trunk, surprisingly practical back here, except you got a pretty high load in height. If you want to lift anything into the trunk, it's got to go over the whole bumper, the license plate, the reverse lights. It's a pretty tall lift, and the load-in actually kind of steals a little bit of trunk space at the edge. Not really the best design, but that's how they did it. Also in the trunk, you will notice the CD changer mounted here. You could open it up, load in your CDs, and then listen while you drove along. Unless you wanted to change CDs, then you had to park the car, go into the trunk, and change them manually. Wasn't the best situation, but it was better than a single disc CD like plebeians had. Now, the other interesting thing back here is the rear light bar situation. This entire bar going across the back of the car gave it a very distinct, very different look than anything else had, General Motors or otherwise. It was totally alien at the time. Unfortunately, the center part doesn't light up. Only the outside lights, or the brake lights, the turn signals, and the tail lights. The center was just here for style, but it did look, well, cool and different. The more interesting lighting quirk with this car is actually in front. If you were driving along with the headlights on and you put on the turn signal, a little light on the side of the car would light up to illuminate the path you were about to turn into. This was called a cornering light, and a few cars used it in the 90s. Nobody really cared, and most of them dropped it, although it has returned in a lot of luxury vehicles today. But back then, this was a cool cutting-edge feature, and the Aurora had it. All right, driving the original Oldsmobile Aurora. Now, one interesting part of Aurora history, this car was such a gamble and such a risk and so different, whatever, but then in true GM style, when they saw it didn't really do all that well and nobody really cared, they came out with a second generation Aurora that was just kind of a normal sedan. They were just like, yeah, we tried, and now we'll go back to the normal stuff we do. So driving this car, you know, 250 horsepower front wheel drive, I mean, it's not good. It wasn't intended to be like an exciting sports sedan. It was intended to like bring a new meaning to luxury sedan. It was the Acuras and the Lexuses, not the BMWs. Sedans, luxury cars in general, have become a lot sportier since the Aurora's time, the early mid-90s. Back then it was pretty common to have your luxury car have no level of sporting pretense at all, just kind of a luxury thing. And so that's what they were going for here. And I gotta say, with that in mind, And judging this car based on the context of its day, not a modern perspective, this car actually drives surprisingly well. It's not fast, it doesn't accelerate fast, but again, it wasn't intended to be, just powerful enough. It had a V8 and it would keep up with traffic, and you know, that was the goal. But in terms of like the way it feels, it's better than I would ever have expected from a 90s General Motors vehicle. I end up driving a lot of 90s GM vehicles in my videos because they made some quirky stuff this time. And I just recently drove that giant Oldsmobile station wagon or Buick station wagon that Hoovie had. And it was just, you know, it's a big old boaty General Motors car. This vehicle wasn't that. It was surprisingly, I don't want to say tight because it doesn't feel like tight in terms of handling, but it feels like nicely made, like well put together in a surprising way. The steering doesn't have an enormous amount of play in it. Now, it's not incredibly precise or quick, but it doesn't have a lot of play. It feels like, honestly, other 90s luxury cars of the time, Lexus, Acura, etc. Also, there's no like squeaks and rattles in here. Now, like I said earlier, this is a one-owner car with 63,000 miles, so this is a nice one, but it seems pretty well put together for General Motors at this time. And again, everything is laid out in here in this kind of cockpit fashion, which has become more and more in vogue over the years. There's also the fact that the driving experience, I mean, there's no like throttle delays or crazy body roll. This drives like a pretty nicely done car. And if you would just put me in this with a blindfold in the back seat, I would tell you, I would think it's definitely a 90s, early 90s luxury car based on the smooth leather and the, you know, 4-speed auto you can feel, but it may be Acura or Lexus. Like, this is decent. The problem was never with the Aurora was never that it wasn't a good car. I think everybody agreed that it was at the time. The problem was the Oldsmobile brand was beyond saving by then. And even though they came out with a pretty good luxury sedan, it was never gonna beat even Lexus, which was new. Like, Oldsmobile was so bad that it wasn't even as good as something that had no brand history at all. That was the that was how bad the perception of Oldsmobile was. This was better than other 90s GM cars. It is not so bad to drive. Again, not sporty, but like a nice car that you could drive around. And then the styling was just totally spaceship futuristic. The drawback ultimately came with the brand name, and they just weren't able to get past that, which isn't really a surprise. Oldsmobile. Even now, 20 years later, it has negative connotations, and it hasn't been on the market since '04. It just was never gonna bring the people, no matter how different or cool or exciting it was. And it does seem like a pretty competent car. And so that's the 1995 Oldsmobile Aurora. It was the future, or at least the future as General Motors saw it back in the 1990s. It was a bleak future in the sense that it failed miserably, but it is fun to look back now and see where they thought the car world would go and all the quirks and features that came with it. Anyway, now it's time to give the Aurora a DougScore. And the DougScore is here, 41 out of 100, which puts the Aurora here against similar 1990s luxury and near-luxury models. The Aurora is cool. It's an interesting look back and an attempt to innovate, and especially interesting because, well, it failed. By today's standards, it just seems like a 1990s car with more quirks than other 1990s cars, and it's hardly a standout in any DougScore category that would earn it a higher placement on this list.